December 27th, 2018. Here I am at the Commonwealth War Cemetery in Yokohama with the groundskeeper, Mr. Kobayashi. And today we'll talk about Canada and the Battle of Hong Kong. Okay. Hong Kong was the first place Canadians fought a land battle in the Second World War. From 8th to 25th December 1941, almost 2,000 troops from Winnipeg and Quebec City, sent to Hong Kong expecting little more than guard duty, fought bravely against the overwhelming power of an invading Japanese force. When the British colony surrendered on Christmas Day, 290 Canadians had been killed in the fighting. Another 264 would die over the next 4 years amid the inhumane conditions of Japanese prisoner of war camps. Here's a picture of several of those who fell. Why Canadian troops went to Hong Kong. Canada entered the Second World War against Germany in 1939, but the Canadian Army saw little action in the early years of the conflict. For one thing, Canada's military was small and unprepared for war. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King was also cautious about committing the country to battle. After the heavy bloodletting and the domestic divisions of the First World War, King was wary of sending large numbers of soldiers to fight overseas, something that might require conscription and reignite conflict between French and English-speaking Canadians. Instead, King sought other ways for Canada to help the war effort, such as making armaments, growing food, and training air crews under the new British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. The Royal Canadian Navy had been involved in the Battle of the Atlantic since 1939, and Canadian airmen had made a small contribution to the Battle of Britain. But the Army was not actively engaged in war, despite growing pressure among English Canadians for a greater role. So, in 1941, when Britain made a request for Canadian troops to help bolster its remote Asian colony of Hong Kong, the King government agreed to send 2 battalions overseas for what it assumed would merely be garrison duty. Hong Kong in November 1941. Japan had been waging war in China since 1937, but it had avoided open hostilities against the West. By 1940, the British were fighting for survival against Germany. They realized that defending Hong Kong would be virtually impossible if the colony and other Asian possessions were attacked by Japan. Even so, Britain decided that a show of force might deter any possible Japanese aggression. It sought troops to reinforce the British and Indian units already garrisoned in Hong Kong. The King government agreed to dispatch 2 battalions. Harry Crerar, Chief of the General Staff, assigned the task to the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada from Quebec City. Both units had some experience serving on garrison duty. However, neither was at full strength in 1941 or adequately trained for the modern warfare of the time. Neither regiment had even participated in battalion-level training exercises. No matter, a Japanese attack against the British territories in the Pacific seemed unlikely. Even if one came, the prevailing racial attitudes of the time convinced many Canadian and British military leaders that superior white troops would teach the Japanese a lesson. The 2 undermanned Canadian battalions were quickly filled out with additions of new, inexperienced troops and shipped across the Pacific under the command of Brigadier J.K. Lawson. The force included 1,973 officers and men, plus 2 nursing sisters. It arrived in Hong Kong on 16th November, joining a military garrison that now totaled about 14,000. Here is a picture of D Company, the Winnipeg Rifles, in their ship on the way to Hong Kong. Here is a picture of the Canadian soldiers arriving in Hong Kong. garrison's task was to defend a small hill-capped colony of 1.6 million residents spread across a section of the mainland, including the new territories and Kowloon, as well as Hong Kong Island itself. The defenders had only a few naval vessels at their disposal and no air force to speak of. To make matters worse, the Canadian contingent's vehicles, sent across the Pacific on a separate ship from the troops, arrived not in Hong Kong, but in Manila, where they had been diverted for use by American forces. On 7 December, 3 weeks after the Canadians arrived in Hong Kong and had begun to settle into the quiet routines of garrison life, Japan stunned the world by attacking the United States naval fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Suddenly, the whole Pacific theater, once an afterthought in the early years of the Second World War, was now at the very forefront of the conflict. Invasion and the defense of Hong Kong. 6 hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese 38th Division, made up of well-trained, battle-hardened troops, attacked Hong Kong. The invaders bombed the colony's airfield and other military installations and quickly overran the troops defending the mainland portion of the territory. The defenders here included the men of D Company of the Winnipeg Grenadiers, who on 11 December 1941 became the first Canadian Army troops to engage in combat in the Second World War. This is a map of the Hong Kong defenses at the time. Here's an overview picture of the defenses of Hong Kong. After 5 days of fighting, Kowloon and the mainland fell to the Japanese. Major General C.M. Maltby, Hong Kong's military commander, refused Japanese demands for surrender, despite there being no hope of relief from outside the colony. Instead, Maltby relied on his remaining untested soldiers, including the bulk of the Canadian battalions, to defend Hong Kong Island, where most of the civilian population lived. Maltby split his island forces into 2 brigades, one encompassing the Royal Rifles of Canada under the overall command of British Brigadier C. Wallace, and the other, including the Winnipeg Grenadiers, under the overall command of Brigadier Lawson from Canada. For the next 2 weeks, the troops of each brigade fought for their lives. Short of water, without adequate transportation, and pounded by the enemy's superior artillery and command of the skies, the defenders did what they could do to stem the Japanese advance, following their amphibious landing on the island's beaches. Valor and sacrifice. Despite the inexperience, the Canadians and their allied comrades fought tenaciously to counterattack the Japanese assault. There were numerous examples of bravery. On 19th December, the second day of fighting on the island, the troops of A Company of the Winnipeg Grenadiers had dug themselves into defensive positions following a retreat from the high ground of Mount Butler. Having surrounded the Winnipeggers, the Japanese began lobbing grenades into the Canadian positions. Company Sergeant Major John Osborne picked up several live grenades and threw them back at the enemy. When one fell where Osborne could not return it in time, he shouted a warning to his men and then threw himself on the bomb to smother the explosion. He was killed instantly, but he saved the lives of several soldiers who would soon be taken prisoner when the Japanese rushed the Canadian position. Osborne was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the British Empire's highest award for wartime valor. Here are Canadians holding the position, probably the Winnipeg Grenadiers. Here is Sergeant Major Osborne. The same day, Brigadier Lawson's headquarters became surrounded by attackers at the Wang Ne Chong Gap, a strategic pass where a main road cut through the center of the island. With Japanese soldiers firing almost point blank into his bunker, Lawson sent a radio message to Maltby, the colony's commander, that he was going outside to fight it out with the enemy. Lawson was quickly killed, but the Japanese would later make note of how he died heroically. On Christmas Day, with ammunition in short supply and the defending soldiers in desperate shape, D Company of the Royal Rifles was ordered to make what appeared to be a suicidal attack to retake lost ground at the south end of the island. According to an account from Sergeant George MacDonald, the men received the orders in stunned silence. Not one of them could believe such a preposterous order. Attacking with bayonets, the Royal Rifles succeeded in taking the position at a cost of 26 men killed and 75 wounded. Hours later, the exhausted survivors learned that the colony had surrendered. The Battle of Hong Kong was over. Prisoners of war. The horror for those who remained, however, was only beginning. Although some Japanese units behaved with discipline after the battle, others carried out a campaign of terror, bayoneting wounded Allied soldiers in the hospital, killing and raping nurses, and mutilating some prisoners. The civilian residents of Hong Kong now faced years under harsh Japanese occupation. The captured British, Indian, and Canadian soldiers, considered cowards by the Japanese for surrendering, became prisoners of war, first at camps in Hong Kong and later in Japan, where they endured years of beatings, hard labor, and inadequate diets. Hundreds of the Canadian POWs died of illness or from slow starvation. Here is a picture of the Canadians in Hong Kong at the fall. More of the defenses of Hong Kong. Here they are again in prison camps in Hong Kong before being sent to Japan. Here they are again. In August 1945, almost 4 years after the fall of Hong Kong, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan's surrender and ended the war in the Pacific. The American military delivered food and medical help to the camps, where POWs were suffering from diseases caused by the vitamin deficiency. Again, correction, this is in Japan.
Not in Japan.
Yeah. And so is this one. Japanese prisoner of war camp.
Not Hong Kong.
Not Hong Kong. The other one's Hong Kong. Memory of the 1,975 Canadians sent to Hong Kong, 290 were killed and 493 wounded during the battle and its immediate aftermath. Proof, said veterans decades later, that they had resisted fiercely and courageously before surrendering to the enemy. Another 264 Canadians died as prisoners of war, while 1,418 survivors returned to Canada, many of them deeply bitter at the cruelty of their Japanese captors. At home, political pressure forced the government in Ottawa to appoint a royal commission to investigate the circumstances of Canada's involvement in Hong Kong. The sole commissioner, Chief Justice Lyman Duff, misinterpreted or ignored evidence and exonerated the cabinet, the Department of National Defense, and senior members of the military's general staff. In 1948, a confidential analysis by General Charles Folks, Chief of the General Staff, found that many errors in Duff's assessment, but concluded that proper training, staffing, and equipment would have made little difference, given the overwhelming odds facing the defenders. The 554 Canadians who died in Hong Kong and in prisoner of war camps afterwards are remembered today by a memorial to all of Hong Kong's defenders at the Sai Wan Bay War Cemetery there. This and the Stanley Military Cemetery in Hong Kong also hold the individual graves of 303 Canadian soldiers, 108 of whom are unidentified. Another 137 Canadians, most of them died as prisoners of war, are buried at the British Commonwealth War Cemetery at Yokohama, Japan. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from falling hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. John McCrae, 1915. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember that.